I'm Katharine Horowitz, and I'm a sound designer and currently designing sound for Romeo and Juliet at Park Square Theater.
And I'm Andrea. I'm a freelance costume designer in the Twin Cities, also working on this production of Romeo and Juliet.
And we thought it would be cool if we got together and interviewed each other, since sound and costumes rarely work together. We're always like two ships passing in the night. But for this particular show, I really thought it would be great because it was actually Andrea's costumes which influenced my sound design for R&J. I really was unsure where to begin with our director David Mann's concept of the world, and so I contacted her and asked what the costumes were going to look like and what sort of the concept and the feeling was, and it sort of was able to guide me in the right direction of the music and the sound. And that is about the first time I think I've ever asked help from costumes for inspiration. So, costumes for R&J.
The costumes for this production, we started conversations in April of last year, which is probably the longest lead time I've had on a design in a very long time, maybe not ever. But one of the reasons that it matters so much is because this is a very tight cutting of the play. It's being produced for the Theater for Young Audiences program at Park Square. We're down to 90 minutes. We have 9 actors playing all of the roles. Romeo, Juliet, and Father Capulet don't double, which leaves us with 6 bodies to play 18 roles. Those are some of the physical parameters that had to be considered. The fact that the show would be remounted, hopefully in perpetuity.
I think so.
Is also a consideration from a design standpoint. But ultimately, what I'm really glad we had as much time as we did to work on was the concept that David wanted to present, which was that it was of most interest to him with high school audience members to highlight the conflict between the generations more so than between the two households. We wanted to really create a world that supports the text but supports it for young audiences. So it needed to be something that people felt some amount of familiarity and comfort with, but also understood as soon as you looked at it that this wasn't modern day. It wasn't something that you would wear yourself or that you would see someone in on the street, but it wasn't so foreign as to be a full, rigid, pitch perfect period Elizabethan production. We needed to be able to support the sword fights. That was of utmost importance. We couldn't create a universe in which the fact that they were also carrying swords didn't make sense. And it mattered to me in that realm of finding something familiar but also foreign, that we were serving to support the text in the same way, because I think high school students approach the language of Shakespeare assuming that they can't understand it and find that it is in fact not that different from the way we speak now, provided it's done well, which I would venture to say it is in this production.
Yeah.
And so those were some of the places that we started in conversation. And where that ended up for us and the research that Katharine asked me for and then worked off of is that we ended up with something that's sort of a mashup of current high fashion with Elizabethan silhouette and detail. The best example of that, I think, where it's most successful is in the menswear. The young teenage boys are in extremely high-waisted skinny jeans and short motorcycle jackets that are only connected at the shoulder cap, so they function like an Italian Renaissance fighting doublet, but they look like a modern motorcycle jacket. And the adult men, Capulet and Montague, have far more Elizabethan influence in their clothes. Hanging robes, big loose vests, high collars, big cuffs on their clothes. It also became a world where the adults are in more metallic brocade heavy-duty fabric and the teenagers are in lighter weight denim, more flexibility, more transience. We talked a lot early on about the true teenage nature of these characters and how everything changes from minute to minute to minute for them, and that the clothes needed to reflect that. And so that was the research that I presented to you when you asked for it.
Yeah.
Why don't you
talk
about what you did with that, because I don't actually really know what happened after
I don't know.
sent you all that stuff.
I mean, it just sort of helped to propel me down this sort of divergent world of the two. And David had mentioned inspirational music such as Moby. We were looking at, there was a particular Sia song called Breathe Me that we were also looking at, and those also had the two kind of meshed up in that you could tell they were modern, but they had a lot of different musical sensibilities, like the orchestral wash or an acoustic guitar or piano, but they still have the beat
really
to them.
Classic support.
Yeah.
On a really modern take.
Yeah. And so but I still felt, because so David and I didn't meet about this until I think like November or December, which I find really fascinating that you were working on it all back through April and had time to let it ferment. And that's like what's so different about our working processes is that I really was not able to grasp the sound and the tone of this show until we really started digging into it. And I was really actually able to see everyone in front of me and see how everything was flowing. But you kind of had to have your stuff all set up right there from the start.
And I think that's fairly typical, that sound works a lot later than costumes. I think there's some things I've often envied about that you have a certain flexibility that I don't have. Like, I frequently feel like I'm in a position to say no to people because that ship has sailed. It's already built. We've already purchased it. It's been in rehearsal. I can't deconstruct it and make something else out of it. Which isn't to say that didn't happen on this process.
We deconstructed and
reconstructed some things. But I think you have the opportunity to, I think in some ways you co-create.
Yeah.
More than I do, which is interesting because another thing that you and I have spoken about in preparation for this conversation is the fact that the actors have a far more intimate relationship with my work than they do with yours.
That's true.
And yet to a certain extent I'm handing it to them finished.
Right.
And that varies with different relationships with different actors, with different rehearsal processes, how much give and take there's room for. But in this case, we really had the world kind of on lockdown before rehearsal started.
And I was still sort of floating in free fall until panicking. So do you think that maybe, at least for this show, that the costumes are supporting the actors that the costumes support the characters and maybe the sound supports the atmosphere or the text?
I do. I think these costumes are so much more specific, and again, to use the word prescribed, that it is much more of a character support than an actor tool. When I work on modern pieces and we're using clothes that everybody recognizes and people are comfortable in, I really try to consider my work to be a toolbox I'm giving a director and an actor to do whatever they need to with. And that's been less the case here because these things are, to a certain extent, more fitted.
Yeah.
And they don't allow for as much conversation and shift and flow. But I also think that your work has created a world which it's interesting to me that you started your process out of my work, and then as we sat through tech last week, when there were times where I wasn't sure what direction to go with something to stay in the world, the sound design is then what helped answer those questions. Because you had created something that works in the story and the text, but also just rounds out the world. It's so much underscoring.
There is, yeah.
Which isn't always the case, I think. And so there's a way that the arc of the story is supported, but the world we're in is really solidified by the soundscape. And that often helped me as I considered what I wanted to shift or change to know how modern to push it or how classically to base it.
Yeah. One of the other things that I found fascinating in the dichotomy of our work is, so we were, sitting around the production meeting giving notes, and you were talking, I think, about Tybalt's collar and some way to, I know nothing about sounds or about costumes, but it was something like in terms of just of the stitching and so that how you could make it sit a little higher up like that. And I just found that just tiny little thing that could shape the way a costume sits and the way that it looks to be so fascinating. And so I started just thinking about the other ways that like tiny little shifts in change or in sound can change the design, like a cymbal swell,
right?
Can just sort of propel this scene and make it so much more emotional or more moody, or even just the adjustment of 3 decibels or something.
Right. Or the timing of something too. I think that like the amount of time we spent working on, because it's so heavily underscored, spending all that time in tech really working on getting the timing worked out means that when we've sat in previews last week and watched it, it's amazing how well it all fits together. And I think in some ways that's, I have sometimes worked with sound designers who feel like when their work is not noticed, then they've done their job correctly.
Right.
And maybe you felt that way about some projects you've done, but no one could feel that way about this project.
That's the
because
sound
the two are
designer's curse.
so
Yeah.
integral,
Yeah.
right? Well, and our curse is that people got up in the morning and put clothes on, so they assume it's easy.
Exactly.
I mean, we can all sit and
Yep.
we can all sit and come up with what the thing is.
Yep.
Pardon me.
But but David did want to have, like, he was very, very clear that he wanted a cinematic type of feel for the whole show, for sound, costumes, lights, everything. And and I think we've grabbed that.
I do. I do think so.
Yeah.
I think in that same way that you're talking about, so you've got this sort of structure and world that you've created, and you're talking about small shifts in things.
Right.
You're right. Tacking things down in a certain way to create a sharper contrast is something that we've worked with a little bit on this show. Trying to find ways, we've worked both directions here, trying to make things more structural, usually for the adults, or more flexible for the younger people. And those are sort of then technical tricks or cutting, stitching, patterning things that we're doing that no one would necessarily notice, in the same way that I might not know the difference. I might not hear the difference in 3 decibels, but I feel it.
Right.
I know that something is different than the last time that we ran it.
So what's a trick? All right, so what's a technical trick that you have if you can't, you're not going to fully reshape a costume, like I'm not going to fully reshape a sound cue or a piece of music, but you need to make it slightly different in shape, not literally, but you know what I mean?
Oh, or literally. So in the example that you're talking about with Tybalt's collar, I had found layers of fabric that flat on the table at this distance created a really fantastic texture that I loved very much. And in practice, once they were applied to this large shawl collar that stands up and floats out to his shoulders, there were too many things going on, and it got muddy and mushy, and he sort of looked like he had a scrunched up scarf like I'm wearing now on, instead of a sharp motorcycle jacket.
Right.
And ultimately we ended up recutting that collar out of different fabric that had more body to it to create that stiffness. But before we got there, we started by sizing it. I folded it under and stitched it in place to get it to be a little bit shorter so it wouldn't flop so much, and then I placed swing tacks in certain spots at the shoulders and the center back to try to help it stay standing up, which helped but didn't totally fix the problem. And so then ultimately what we did was find different fabric to use, removed that collar from it, cut it out, and reapplied something that looks much better.
I can sew my socks when there's a hole in them.
Sure.
And I knit. And that's about it.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by the fit. I'm fascinated by the fabric in this show. What I think the compare and contrast of the costumes versus the sound is, when I'm really thinking about it, and the more that we talk, is the not the theme that I created, the little waltzy thing, but what is underneath it. So underneath that theme that we've got going on, and in various other transitions, are these orchestral washes and harps and little cymbal swells and things like that. And I think that that's where, looking at your costumes and the deep color of the scarlet or whatever, the crimson that the boys have on, and that kind of thing really came into play in terms of the sound, is that sort of long, sustained tension string wash. I don't know if I'm describing that correctly. There's a whole album on iTunes of orchestral washes. When I found that, I was just like, oh my God, my world has changed.
So mine. I would point out that when Katharine says that little theme, she's talking about the things she composed for this piece, which repeats itself in many ways that you never even really understand. You're hearing the same thing. You're just having an emotional experience that's tied together by these notes in succession with each other. It's not a little thing at all.
Well, it was the first time. Here's another thing we could talk about, is first time things. This is the first time that I've really kind of composed a show from scratch in a deep, profound way.
Right.
More than just a little like, well, here's a little bit of and a little and, but an
Yeah.
actual melody that goes on
Yeah.
and
A full composition
A full
piece.
composition.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm super proud of it, and it was a heck of a lot of work. But I think it's made even more powerful by the fact that this is a show that's going to go on in perpetuity.
Right.
And I think that's what made probably both of us go just like that extra mile.
Yes.
You know?
Yep. This is the first time outside of an academic setting. I ran a shop at a liberal arts college where I then, in theory, had a tribe of labor that I could exact my designs out of. It didn't always work that way. But as a freelance person on my own, this is the first thing I've built from the ground up.
Really?
Yeah, outside of an academic setting,
Yeah.
without a shop support. Well, by cobbling together a shop to support the work.
Yeah, because all of these costumes are, I mean, they're not pulled.
No.
They're all
The
original.
2 adult men are based on modern suits that we bought, but we bought 2 of each of them so that we could use one for yardage to create
Sure.
other things. That is actually the only purchased thing.
Yeah.
Everything else has been patterned and built from scratch. And that, yeah, so that hasn't happened for me in years, and certainly not when it was just me figuring out how to get it done with the fantastic help of many other people. By no means do I mean just me figuring out how to
No.
get it done. That I think has been personally really rewarding and professionally rewarding, but I also am extremely gratified to recognize how much that supports the storytelling in this
Yeah.
version. How much it matters that we didn't just buy skinny jeans and try to make that work, but we built these pants with these really high waists that we couldn't have gotten, and
Right.
the way that that elongates the form of the person wearing them, and the way that it creates this really dynamic physical element. Another thing that David and I talked a lot about early on was the incredible importance of how dangerous this world is,
Right, exactly.
and never losing sight of how dangerous this time and place is. And I think that by creating this line that, to repeat myself ad nauseum, is familiar but foreign.
Mm-hmm.
They're pants and jackets, we know what that is, but we've never seen it in this combination. It's just a little bit strange, a little bit skewed. I think helps people's attention stay with it. I hope that that's what happens. And I think we couldn't have done that if we had tried to alter existing things.
There's no way that the sound design would have worked if I had pulled pre-existing music.
Right.
The party scene has pre-existing music, but that's kind of because it's of the world.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually having a party, so there's party music
Playing.
and I pulled that. But that's true, and that's a lot of times that where I've thought of that exact same thing. Where if I had pulled something like some of Moby's music that we used for inspiration, it would have been nice and it would have sounded great.
Right.
But there's no way I would have been able to shape it to fit
Yeah.
the certain moods that we needed, the certain timing that we needed, you know, to break it apart in the different layers, the multi-track layers of sound. It just wouldn't have been the same, and it wouldn't have been as gratifying, I
Yeah.
think. You know?
That's true.
That's mainly what it is.
That's true. And it wouldn't have been any less work.
Yeah. It would
Right?
have been
I think there's
maybe
a
just as much-
fallacy for all
right.
of our disciplines that, like, oh, if I can just do something with found objects. I think there is a world in which a design concept of found objects where they're meant to then continue looking like they're or sounding
Yeah.
like the found object. That's one thing. But if you're going to purchase something and pull it apart and put it back together as something else,
You might as
then
well.
the only real advantage to that is that it has the texture that you want or another quality that you couldn't replicate on your own.
Right.
Otherwise, it's no less work,
Right.
for sure.
It's the same amount of work almost, I'd say, and it's less gratifying because you didn't create it yourself. Now, granted, I did pull the orchestral washes because I don't have an orchestra at my fingertips.
Sure.
But you know, it's the same. It's just there to sort of boost it and support it.
I often tell theater students or young designers, young theater people that I consider myself a storyteller and that costumes is just my medium. So there's something about the story that captures my mind. It might be the relationships between people. It might be the way that language is used. It's usually something image-based, And so in the case of relationships, you know, whether they're balanced relationships or inequitable relationships, whether there's a power struggle going on and how that manifests itself in an image is of interest to me. I think the style of language or the style of storytelling matters a lot to me, whether something is epic in nature or short, small little vignettes. That can really influence, sometimes from a technical standpoint of how are they going to change clothes that many times or that fast. But hopefully before I get into the nitty gritty of the real problem solving of it, I have the opportunity to sit with what it reminds me of, what it makes me think of, and then try to think about why that is. Like if a particular art style comes to mind or a particular color comes to mind, what is that about?
Oh, yeah.
And why?
Yeah.
Not just, I mean, sometimes I just grab it and run with it. Sometimes it's just yellow.
Right.
But like there was a version of this design early on where the Capulets were green. Now they're kind of a mustardy yellow. I'm not even entirely certain that I can remember why the first was true or why it changed. But having the luxury of being able to really think about what things play opposite each other well, what things play together well, and how you can use that, I think is a really great thing. I don't know that I always have the opportunity to be really overt with that, but I'm also not sure that every story is served by it all being really overtly designed with a heavy hand.
Well, you and I
this
were
is super exciting because this story totally lets me just go nuts with all of that.
Yeah.
In a way that, you know, if we were telling the Cripple of Inishmaan, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something like really realistic and really immediately documentary, and you're not serving the story by doing that, you're showing off.
Right.
that you have a paintbrush and you got to do
We were talking about that
with.
earlier. Maturing as designers, to the point where we now think, are we serving the story or are we just showing off?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've had some moments this week where I'm like, I don't want to make that change. What's that about?
Yeah.
Is that because I'm attached to the idea I had, or is it because I actually think the idea we have works better than a different idea?
Right. And there are a lot of moments during tech that I was acutely aware of, is the sound design insisting upon itself right now?
Yes.
You know, like, is it too loud, but is there just too much of it? You know, is it too present? Could we do without this right here?
Yeah.
Because we want it to be sort of cinematic, but I don't want it to be like, hey. Yeah. So like, for instance, like we had a little sort of cello-y underscore for when Mercutio dies. And I saw that during one of our runs, and I'm like, nope, too much, too heavy-handed. Here's a frying pan, let me beat you over the head with it. We're cutting that. We do not need that.
Right.
Or we can pull back on the volume a little bit about this, because it's not serving the story, and it's just making fireworks out of the sound design, and that's not the point.
Right.
Even though sometimes I'd love to have just big fat sound show.
Sure. What captures your imagination about a script?
I am really fascinated about the psychological effect that sound design can have on a person. And so if the script is something that serves in that capacity, I just glom onto it. The way that sound can sort of creep up on you, almost literally, and you don't know that it's there until it's there, and then you're just like, what the hell? Or when it's taken away. If we want to segue to a different show, I'm currently designing Here at Mixed Blood by Taylor Mack, and it's not a sound heavy show at all, but what it does have are a lot of different frequencies. So there's a portable air conditioner that's constantly running.
Okay.
And you'd think that would be really easy, and in a way it is, but there's like 5 or 6 different air conditioner sounds I have, and I was like, does this work? Does this work? Does this work? This is too low. This is too high. This is too, this, and at one point the director, Nigel, said, no, this air conditioner sound matches too well with Sally Wingert's voice. She's the star of the show, because she's an alto, and it's competing with the tone and the timbre of her voice. I was like, oh,
nice,
cool.
Nice.
And then when that gets taken away, you just notice this stunning
Sure.
silence that just hangs over the room. And then, you know, there's also like they have NASCAR car racing on, so we've got that sort of beehive sound.
I'm having a psychological reaction to this without even knowing the narrative of the story or anything else about it. But just
Right.
the idea of these two things happening.
And it's supposed to
putting
be
me in
sort of
place.
like this discordant family
Sure.
comedy drama sort of thing. So there's a point to that. But so anyway, that's what I'm really fascinated about. And I love, I mean, like you, I love creating worlds.
Yeah.
So that's what captures my imagination when I read a script, is like, all right, how can I most effectively capture the world of this show that people actually feel like they're there.
Mm-hmm.
Another good example is when I designed Ruined at Mixed Blood several years ago. I read every book I could about the Congo. And I wrote down, like, in my diary, I wrote down every single sound description there was, and I poured through all the ornithological sites for the birds that are specific to Uganda and the DRC, so that it was just like, there's not a robin, it's a Rufus nightjar, which is also my drag name. Anyway, but that's what I'm really fascinated about, and that's what really captures my imagination, is capturing that world and capturing the psychological essence of that world.
And then, I mean, I think, again, what we've managed to accomplish here is a real degree of specificity without it being any one time or place.
Yep, absolutely.
Another thing we were joking about when we were talking about having matured as designers was the idea that and I think sometimes it is a lazy choice when someone says, I want it to be all the time periods and none of the time periods.
Yeah.
And I think that in this instance, it really is the way to best serve this version of the text, because it's so brief and so specific and so concisely cut that it doesn't make sense to put it on parade as a big period spectacle.
Yeah.
But you can't effectively tell it in jeans and t-shirts either.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an overstatement to say you can't effectively tell it that way, but that was never the idea here. That was never the desired outcome. We wanted to present something truly theatrical, in spite of the fact that it has all these wonderful cinematic qualities to it. There's something about this experience, and I think too, somebody else mentioned this week, this is the first thing that's been fully developed for the thrust space at Park Square, for the new 3/4 thrust.
Oh, really?
Because they've done work there all year, but they're plays that were written other places or have been produced other places in different ways. It's not to say those weren't successful, but I think there's something about the immediacy and the danger we've talked about and the specificity that then having teenagers 3/4 of the way around the stage on top of what's going on is also really well served by the way that we've produced this. I think if we were going to do even the same 90-minute cutting in their proscenium space, with that much of a reserve from the audience, that much distance, that much throw, all these other, I don't think either of our work would be the same.
No. Yeah. No,
at all.
No, vastly different.
Yeah.
Vastly different.
I hadn't thought about that till just now, but that's really interesting to me.
So the other thing that I find interesting is that this show is in perpetuity. And so we have a chance to improve upon our work every year or bemoan it.
We have permission at this point in the process to say, that's not something I'm going to go after this time around.
We do. But at the same time, since the public performances are this year, we're kind of like, we want to get it on right now.
Right.
But I'm really interested in, and I don't know that we can answer this right now, but I'm interested in what we would think about it, what we're going to think about it next year, what we might change about it next year, and then 4 and 5 years from now.
I've never had that opportunity before. This is the first time I've done something knowing that it was going to be remounted this way.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating opportunity.
It really is.
To pace myself a little bit as a designer too. Like, it's so exciting. We're going to build the whole show. It's the first time I'm doing that. I could just keep going and going and going. And then where would I be?
Right.
Or, we can make sure that the goals we set out for ourselves have been met this time around. Nobody's embarrassed by their work, certainly.
Yeah.
But there's also, at some point, no reason to beat it about the neck and shoulders trying to force it to be something that we don't have the physical or monetary or personal resources anymore to keep going at.
Yeah.
Because we're going to have the opportunity to take a big breath, literally put it away in a box and bring it back out and reconsider it again.
Right, right. Check in again
Yes.
with us in like 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
See what we think.
Absolutely.
Well, all right. I think this is good.
Yeah.
I think you actually have to get back to work.
That's true.
On
I
the
do.
rest of your costumes.
That's true, I do.
And I have to get back to my tech at Mixed Blood. So anyway,
Thank you.
great. Thanks.